You already know this story. You may not know that you know it, but it is in you somewhere. It is one of the most repeated facts about human beings of the last 60 years. It goes like this. A young woman in New York was attacked outside her building, and 38 people watched from their windows. For more than half an hour, the story says, 38 respectable, law-abiding people watching, and not one of them picked up a telephone, not one shouted, not one came down. They watched the way you watch weather, and then they went back to bed. That story ran on the front page of the New York Times in 1964, and it did not stay a news story. It became something much larger. It became a diagnosis of cities, of modern life, of us. The proof that people had become the kind of animal that watches. It went into the textbooks. It launched an entire field of research. It is taught in first-year psychology right now, this term, in most of the world. It helped push a country into building an emergency number, because in 1964 there was not one. And it gave us a phrase that everybody uses, the bystander effect. And underneath all of it, sitting at the bottom like a foundation stone, is that number, 38. It is the number that makes the story unbearable. It is the number that makes it mean something. And it was wrong. Not slightly, not a rounding error. The number came from a remark made by one man over lunch, and it was printed without anybody checking it. And almost everything built on top of it has been quietly falling down for 20 years, while the story itself kept going. So let us go back and take it apart properly. And I want to start with the woman herself, because the story we tell has almost erased her. Her name was Catherine Genovese. Everyone called her Kitty. She was 28. She managed a bar. She was coming home from work at about 3 in the morning on the 13th of March, 1964. She lived in Kew Gardens, in Queens, an ordinary neighbourhood, apartment blocks, a row of shops, a railway line, the kind of place where nothing is supposed to happen. She was attacked near her building by a man who had followed her and who had gone out that night looking for someone. He was caught, tried, and convicted, and that is as much as we need to say about him. 2 weeks later, the Times published the article that made this famous. And here is the thing that matters most about it. The article was not really about the murder, it was about the neighbours. The killing was the occasion, the subject. The thing the paper wanted to say was that a city had gone cold. And the number came from a lunch. The paper's metropolitan editor was eating with the city's police commissioner, and the commissioner mentioned the case and mentioned a figure, 38. It was an offhand count from a police file of people who had been spoken to, not people who had watched, not people who had understood what they were hearing. It was never checked before it was printed, and the first sentence of that article did the work. More than half an hour. 38 respectable, law-abiding citizens. 3 separate attacks. Not one telephone call until she was already dead. Later analysts, going through it line by line, have counted dozens of significant factual errors in that piece, several of them in that opening sentence alone. It is one of the most consequential paragraphs ever printed in an American newspaper, and it does not survive contact with the record. So what did those neighbours actually experience? Start with the most basic fact, the one the story requires you to forget. It was the middle of the night. Most of them were asleep, and what woke them was a scream, not a scene, a sound, coming from a street they could mostly not see, near a strip with bars on it, at 3 in the morning. And this matters enormously, because the picture in your head is 38 people at 38 windows watching a single continuous event, like an audience. That is not the geometry of that place. From most of those windows, you could not see where she was. The people who heard something heard fragments, seconds, and then quiet. And now the part that got left out. During the first attack, a neighbour opened his window and shouted down into the street, and the attacker ran. He testified to it later. The man ran off. So the neighbour did what a shout is for. He drove him away, and he went back to bed, believing it was over, which is exactly what it looked like. And calls were made. That is now established, despite the headline that said none were. But remember what calling meant that night. There was no emergency number. You had to know the number of a police precinct. You had to explain yourself to whoever answered. And in that neighborhood, at that time, a lot of people had reasons not to want the police in their lives at all. And then there is the fact that undoes the whole legend, because when it was over, a neighbor did come down. Her name was Sophia Farrar. She went out into the dark, not knowing whether the man was still there. She found Kitty, and she held her, and she stayed with her until help arrived, and past the point where anything could be done. So hold the two versions side by side. The story that went around the world says a woman died alone, surrounded by people who did nothing. What actually happened is that a man drove her attacker off with his voice, that calls were made, and that a neighbor ran toward the danger and held her so that she would not be alone. Not one of those people is in the story you were told. So the obvious question, if it was wrong, and wrong in ways that were checkable at the time, how did it survive for half a century? And the answer is uncomfortable, because it is not really about journalism. It is about what the story did for the people who repeated it. It arrived at the perfect moment. A country was arguing with itself about cities, about whether modern life had hollowed people out, about whether the old neighborliness was gone. And here was a story that settled the argument, in one paragraph, with a number attached. Stories that confirm what a society already suspects do not get audited, they get repeated. And there is a cost to that, which is almost never mentioned. Real people lived in that building. They were named as a group, as a moral failure for the rest of their lives. The man who shouted from his window and drove the attacker away was for decades one of the 38 who did nothing. That is what the story did to him. The unpicking took a long time, and it was done properly. A journalist went back through the record in 2004. Psychologists published a full re-examination in 2007 in the same journal that had carried the original research tradition. Books followed. Court transcripts were read again. Surviving neighbours were interviewed, some of them for the first time. And the most careful account came from her own family. Her younger brother spent years going back to that street, finding the people who were there, asking them what they had actually heard and done. He made a film about it. And the newspaper itself has now revisited its own reporting more than once, and acknowledged that central elements of it are false or unsupported, which is the correct outcome. But notice the shape of it. The correction took 50 years, and it is still losing, because you had heard the first version. Almost nobody has heard this one. Now, and this is important, the science that grew out of that story was not fake. Two young psychologists read the article and did something admirable. They stopped moralizing and started testing. Their question was sharp. If people fail to help, is that because they are callous, or is there something about the situation that produces it in perfectly decent people? So they built situations. In one, participants sat filling in a questionnaire while smoke began seeping into the room. Alone, most people got up and reported it quickly. With two calm strangers in the room who had been told to ignore it, many participants sat there, filling in the form, in smoke. And they found two mechanisms, both of them real, and you will recognize both from your own life. The first is diffusion of responsibility. Alone, it is entirely yours. With 10 others, it is a tenth yours, and a tenth of an obligation is much easier to put down. The second is subtler and worse. Everyone in a room is watching everyone else to work out whether this is an emergency, and everyone is being careful not to overreact. So each person sees a room full of calm faces and concludes it must be fine, while every one of those calm faces is a person waiting for somebody else to look alarmed first. Everybody is reading the room, nobody is reading the situation, and the calm is entirely manufactured out of other people's uncertainty. That is genuine, replicated, careful work. It describes something real, and I am not here to knock it down. But look closely at what it measures. It measures the probability that one particular person will act. That is the number that falls when a crowd grows. Hold that thought exactly where it is, because in a moment we are going to put a camera on the street and ask a completely different question. Because for 50 years, nearly everything we knew about this came from laboratories. Staged emergencies, actors, students, situations that everyone involved half suspected were not real. And then something changed, quietly, in the way cities work. We covered them in cameras, which means that for the first time, real emergencies with real strangers are recorded. So a team of researchers did the obvious thing that had never been possible before. They collected the footage, real arguments, real assaults, in public, 219 of them, and they did not do it in one city, because one city proves nothing. They took Amsterdam, and Lancaster in England, and Cape Town in South Africa. 3 places with completely different levels of street violence, different assumptions about strangers, different reputations entirely. If the walk-on by society exists anywhere, it should show up in the differences between them. Then they watched every incident, frame by frame, and coded a single question. Did anybody do anything? In 91% of those conflicts, at least one bystander intervened, usually several, not heroics, not fighting, gesturing at an aggressor to calm down, physically stepping between them, pulling someone away, putting an arm around the person who was being hurt. And the rates did not meaningfully differ between the 3 cities, not between the safest and the most dangerous, not between the richest and the poorest. People stepped in at about the same rate everywhere they looked, which is a strange and rather moving thing to find. It suggests you are not looking at a local custom, you are looking at something closer to a reflex. And then the finding that turns the textbook inside out. The more bystanders were present, the more likely it was that the victim got help, not less, more, which appears to contradict 50 years of laboratory work by researchers who were careful and honest and right. So both things cannot be true, except they are, and working out how is the whole point of this episode. And before we get to that, one more line of evidence, because a single study is never enough. A separate team went at it from a completely different direction, not cameras, paperwork. They read several hundred police case files on public assaults and coded whether anyone present had stepped in. Different country, different method, different researchers. Around 3/4 of them, somebody had intervened. A lower number than the footage gives, which is what you would expect from records written after the fact, and pointing unmistakably the same way, because the contradiction is not real. It only looks real, because 2 different questions have been wearing the same name for 50 years. And once you separate them, everything lines up. Both bodies of research are correct. They were never measuring the same thing. The laboratory asks, will this person help? One participant, one decision, and the answer is genuinely discouraging. Put more people in the room, and the chance that any given individual acts goes down. That is real. It happens in you. But now go and lie on the pavement, and ask the question you would actually be asking. You do not care whether a particular stranger helps. You have no interest in the moral development of the man in the grey coat. You need one thing. You need somebody, anybody. And that is a completely different question with a completely different answer. Because a crowd does two things at once, and we only ever taught the first one. A crowd divides the responsibility. Yes, each person carries a smaller share and is less likely to move. That is the effect in the textbooks. But a crowd also multiplies the pool. 20 people, each somewhat less likely to act, still contain far more chances that at least one of them will. So hear this as plainly as it can be said. The bystander effect is true about individuals and false about crowds. And for the person on the ground, only the second one has ever mattered. And that is what makes this more than an academic correction. Because for 50 years, we took the discouraging half of a true finding and taught it to everybody, on the strength of a story that had the facts wrong. We told a species that mostly helps, that it mostly watches. And we had video evidence to the contrary for years before anybody thought to go and look at it. And when you actually watch that footage, the thing that stays with you is not heroism. Nobody in it looks brave. They look awkward, reluctant, half-committed. Somebody puts a hand out. Somebody else steps in beside them. A third person pulls the aggressor back by the sleeve, and it is done, usually within seconds. That is what help looks like in real life. Not a rescue. A few uncomfortable people deciding not to keep walking. Now, I am not going to hand you a comfortable version of this, because 91% is not 100. Roughly 1 in 10 of those people got nothing. Nobody moved. And those are not a statistical remainder. They are individual human beings who needed somebody in a public place and were left. And help is not evenly distributed. It is far less likely when nobody can tell whether something is a real emergency, which is exactly the ambiguity that swallowed that street in 1964. It is less likely when the cost looks enormous. And it is less likely, and this one should sting, when the person in trouble is read as not being one of us. So if you have been in that position and nobody came, I want to be extremely clear about something. That was not a verdict on you. There is nothing about you that failed to summon help. The failure was never yours. It was in the room. Ambiguity, cost, distance, a dozen mechanics that had nothing to do with your worth. And no statistic in this episode is any comfort if you were the one. And the same goes the other way. If you have ever frozen while something was happening in front of you and carried that since, freezing is not cowardice. It is an involuntary response, well documented, and it happens to trained people. It is worth knowing that, not so you can excuse yourself, but because people who understand freezing recover from it faster and act sooner the next time. And here is the real damage the myth did, and why this is not just tidying up history. Because what do you do if you have been taught that nobody comes? You do not shout. You assume the street is indifferent, so you do not ask it for anything. And as a witness, you assume you would be the only one moving, which is the single most reliable way to keep a person standing still. Which means the story did not merely describe a cold society. It was a set of instructions for building one, and it ran unchallenged through the education of everybody in this conversation, including me. And one more caution about what intervening actually means. Nothing in this episode is an instruction to put yourself in front of a knife. Look again at what those bystanders actually did. Gestures, standing near, saying something out loud, pulling a sleeve, getting between two people who were already losing interest in fighting. Calling is intervening. Making noise is intervening. Standing where you can be seen is intervening. The single most useless response to this material would be to walk toward danger untrained and get hurt. So the practical part, and it is small enough to actually remember. If you ever need help in front of a crowd, do not address the crowd. Point at one person, describe them out loud. You, in the green jacket, call an ambulance. Because the moment somebody is named, the arithmetic collapses. There is no crowd to hide in. It is theirs. And from the other side, if something is happening and nobody has moved, understand what you are actually looking at. Not a street of people who do not care, a street of people, each waiting for a signal that this is real. So be the signal. It does not require courage in the film sense. It requires being obvious. Say something out loud. Move toward it. In that footage, the second person almost always arrives within seconds of the first. And then the strangest lever of all, which is simply knowing this. People who believe intervention is normal intervene more. The belief is doing work, which means the correction to this story is not a piece of trivia. It is closer to a repair. 9 times in 10, somebody moves. You are allowed to expect that, and expecting it makes you one of them. So let us end where it started. On a street in Queens, in the dark, 60 years ago, a young woman was killed there. That is the fact at the center, and no amount of correction improves it. She was 28. She had a life and people who loved her, and a name that got turned into a syndrome. But the last thing that happened on that street was not indifference. A man had already shouted into the dark and driven the attacker off once. Calls had been made. And at the end, a neighbor came down the stairs, not knowing what was waiting, and stayed. The last thing that happened that night was not 38 people watching. It was one woman running toward the dark. For 60 years we told the version that made us despair of each other, and it was not true. The evidence, filmed, counted, checked in 3 countries, says that when it happens in front of people, people move. See what people hide, even from themselves.